Hello and welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, hi, you are very welcome. This is Reading the Past and I'm Dr. Cat. And this one is going to be a little different because today's video is set up to allow me to talk about a collection of things that I've wanted to share with you all for ages, but I wasn't quite sure how to approach. And the reason for my lack of surety in this is that the ideas I'm going to be sharing today regarding individuals' motivations and how they might have affected the events they participated in are my best guess. Based upon the available evidence that I've seen, for sure, but also, maybe mostly, on feelings. This is history by vibes, if you will, and it's certainly not how I would normally recommend that anyone approach a non-fiction exploration of history and the historical record. However, as I think we might all be aware, that is certainly not to say that there aren't a number of people who do exactly that without disclosing or maybe even recognising that that is what they're doing. So we are sort of throwing out the rulebook here. But my plan for 2025 on this channel is to take some risks, to get a bit more experimental. And also, selfishly, I really want to talk about these three people and events and what I feel really went on. The problem is there are huge gaps in the sources in regard to them all, and that does make it different from most of the other events and people that I tend to cover on this channel, where there are potentially a few ways to interpret the evidence, and thus there is space for discourse and debate. In this video, I'm going to be filling the gap in available evidence with interpretation, and so the space for discourse, debate, even dispute, arguably widens. On this channel, when something can be read in more than one way, I will almost always attempt to present a variety of potential interpretations. I will try to highlight the current and ongoing scholarly discourse about any given topic. Today, though, we're throwing that out the window, and I'm going to focus on what I think went on. I'm going to give you my best guess, my conspiracy speculation, if you will, and I do hope that you will find it enjoyable. As you might be able to tell, I am pretty nervous. I'm talking around this quite a lot, so it's so different from what I normally do. However, I'm really excited to give it a go as well. I am so looking forward to reading your thoughts on what I'm about to say in the live chat and or in the comments. Right, that's enough waffle. It's enough procrastination. Let's jump in. I think I will kick off by looking at the most controversial topic we're going to be covering today, because, after all, why not? In for a penny, in for a pound, and all that. It's a mystery that has been responsible for centuries of debate. It has captivated audiences of both fiction and non-fiction. Factions have been formed. On occasion, the opposing sides have not always covered themselves in glory, as there has been some fairly classless, occasionally aggressive behaviour displayed. There have been contradictory publications and documentaries. There have been calls for the exhumation of human remains. There has even been, albeit tangentially, a loosely connected legal battle. I have made a video looking into some of the theories that I will be leaving linked. Have you guessed where I'm going with this yet? Almost certainly, I think. I'm going to tell you what I think happened to Edward V and his brother Richard, Duke of York. The two boys best known to history as the Princes in the Tower. These two princes, when they were aged around 12 and 9 respectively, disappeared from the Tower of London. Their father, King Everett IV, had died on the 9th of April 1483. After his death, the boys' paternal uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, took custody, first of young Edward and then of Richard soon after. The decision to house the boys in the Tower of London was ostensibly taken as a vital step while preparing for the coronation. After all, it was the custom for a new monarch to spend the night, or indeed nights before their coronation, at the Tower, which at that time had luxurious palace apartments. The new monarch would then process from the Tower to Westminster Abbey in order to be crowned. However, a little over 2 months after their father's death, these princes were declared illegitimate, and it was asserted that their parents had never legally been married. This was due to King Edward IV having allegedly been previously pre-contracted to marry Eleanor Butler. This newly recognised illegitimate state prohibited all the children of the union of Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville from ever claiming the throne. Their uncle was crowned as King Richard III on the 6th of July, 1483. Before long, questions began to arise about the whereabouts of the princes, and by the start of the next year, conclusions had seemingly been drawn, and certainly accusations were being thrown. On the 15th of January 1484, at a meeting of the Estates General, William of Rochefort, Chancellor of France, who was presiding over the meeting, reportedly opened the proceedings with a speech that included the following, quote, "Please look at what has happened in that land," meaning England, after the death of King Edward. How his big and noble children were slaughtered with impunity, and the crown of England was brought to their killer by favour of the people. Nearly 2 centuries later, in 1674, human remains were found at the Tower of London by workmen. They were determined to be the remains of children who were around the ages the princes were when they were believed to have disappeared. These remains were then reinterred in Westminster Abbey as the princes on the orders of King Charles II. While in the intervening centuries, there have been many who have accepted, or at least suspected, that Richard III was responsible for the deaths of his nephews, there have been, and are others, who look elsewhere for a culprit. And there are those who claim that the boys were in fact spirited away for their own safety, allowed to grow up and live far away from the dangers of the English royal court. I, however, am increasingly persuaded that these princes were not murdered. I also don't think they escaped, because I think that they might have died from what would come to be known as the English sweating sickness. Now, I want to flag up that nearly all the sources say that this illness was introduced into England by the French troops that accompanied Henry Tudor in 1485, which is, of course, after the princes went missing. And certainly there was an outbreak in that year. However, Heyman, Simons and Coches point out that there was, quote, mention of the disease in 1483 by Erasmus, and the report in the York Civic Records of a pestilence that resembled the English sweat 3 months before the invasion, which acts to shed doubt on the importation theory from France to England by French mercenaries. It was that 1483 mention of this illness by Erasmus that really got my cogs whirring. The sweat was famously terrifying even when it had a name. So the saying went, those afflicted might be merry at breakfast and dead by dinner, and today we still aren't sure what the sweat actually was. And so I've come to wonder if Richard III, fairly newly enthroned, learning that both of his nephews had died following a short illness of rapid onset, an illness that had never been seen before, that had no name, that was unexplainable, might Richard have been concerned that such an event could be viewed by some as evidence of divine judgment, both on his family as a whole and perhaps also on his royal authority. This, I think, could explain the decision to hide the bodies rather than display them, to just show the world that they had died of natural causes, because in this case, I think arguably their deaths could not be explained in a way that didn't risk damaging the regime. I mean, after all, the sweat did not reportedly leave outward signs on the body. They would not have shown signs of the sickness that could thus prove a lack of foul play. And fatal illness in the princes also explains, as far as I'm concerned, the survival of Edward, Earl of Warwick, who was the prince's cousin and the son of Richard III's elder brother George. Arguably, as he was the son of the elder brother, he held a stronger hereditary claim. However, that claim had been nullified due to his father being attainted for treason. But if we're being asked to believe that Richard had illegitimate princes who had been barred from the throne killed to preserve his rule, then why on earth would the son of a traitor be safe? What I will say is that there were reasons why royal children, and indeed royal courts as a whole, chose to spend periods away from the capital, the threat of pestilence being one of them. And while I may increasingly be coming over to the idea that Richard III was not directly responsible for his nephew's death, in that he did not order it, his decision, his choice, to keep his nephews in London for months, when it was clear to him, to everyone, that there was to be no coronation for them to participate in, and to do so, especially during summer, when sickness traditionally spread more virulently, was, I think, arguably, really very negligent of him. Next up, we're hopping into the next century, because I want to offer a counter to the traditional understanding of Catherine Parr's actions following the death of King Henry VIII, particularly in relation to her marriage to Thomas Seymour. Her decision, specifically its timing, is often viewed, I think, as can be exemplified by Catherine's biographer, Susan E. James, who describes it as, quote, fatally reckless and, quote, impetuous. Personally, I don't believe it was anything of the sort, because I think it was a calculated play for political power by Catherine, a gamble that ultimately did not pay off. No doubt, there was an element of personal preference in her choice for a fourth spouse. She had, after all, hoped to marry Thomas after the death of her second husband, John Neville, Baron Latimer, in 1543, and only did not do so because the king began to pursue her for a wife himself. Catherine would write to Thomas that, quote, my mind was fully bent the other time I was at liberty to marry you before any man I know. And so the fact that Thomas was still unmarried when Henry VIII died on the 28th of January 1547 probably did not go unnoticed by Catherine. As Dowager Queen, certain things were expected of Catherine in respects of behaviour and comportment, including how she should approach any future marriage that she might have. Equally, she could arguably expect certain privileges and a recognition of her elevated rank as Dowager Queen. After all, this was the woman who Henry had trusted to leave as his Regent General when he went to war in 1544, and she showed herself to be able in that role. She was a published author of a text entitled Prayers and Meditations. These were reform-leaning faith writings, and after Henry's death she published her next work. This was the now explicitly reformist Lamentation of a Sinner. She was a patron of the arts, who used that patronage to highlight her rank and her place within the royal family. She commissioned miniatures of herself and the king, which she would give out as gifts to family and close friends. And around the time that Henry was busy having his third wife resurrected in this piece, Catherine was busy commissioning this. It is the first extant example of a European queen consort being painted full length and wearing a crown. You might question, where's the crown? Well, notice that crown-topped jewelled brooch right here. On top of this, Catherine was reportedly very popular, if not wholly beloved, by Henry's children. Indeed, according to the letters Prince Edward wrote to Catherine, she was his, quote, mater carissima, his dearest mother. And so I think that Catherine probably expected a prominent role in the government and or household of Edward VI during his minority, and indeed perhaps beyond, in part because of their close relationship and her care for him, but also in part, I think, because she genuinely believed that God had elevated her, first to become Henry's wife and queen, now presumably to become his dowager queen, and in that role she must continue to serve God for the good of her nation and her faith. And so I think she watched on, probably with growing horror and consternation, as she was excluded from the corridors of power and the company of the young king following the death of his father. I think she might have been prepared, perhaps temporarily, to swallow being denied a place at the table of the Regency Council of Edward, and instead resolved to make a play to take custody of the king's person. At that time, the young king's uncle, Edward Seymour, was both Lord Protector of the realm and Governor of the king's person, and so I believe that Catherine's speedy marriage and her subsequent acts were an attempt to alter the rules of this particular game. Her future husband, Thomas, was, after all, Edward Seymour's younger brother, and so he too was uncle to the new king. Thomas was also annoyed that his brother was both Lord Protector and Governor. He wanted one of those roles for himself. Thomas took to sneaking money to his young nephew. He was doing what he could to become the favoured fun uncle. This marital pairing of Edward VI's dearest mother and favoured uncle would, I think, create a household that the young king would actively want to reside in. Thomas then obtained the wardship of Edward's first cousin once removed, Lady Jane Grey, while Katherine Parr took guardianship of Edward's half-sister Elizabeth. Edward and Lady Jane were the same age, while Elizabeth was around 4 years older. These were the adolescent members of the House of Tudor, who would, I think, arguably provide an ideal foundation for the young king's domestic life. His tutelage could easily be maintained, as could him being taught alongside the sons of the nobility, who would, it was hoped, grow up to become his privy chamber. Thomas Seymour had also promised to marry Lady Jane to the king in order to obtain her wardship from her father. Without having to stretch our imaginations too far, I think we can see that Katherine Parr and Thomas Seymour were beginning to curate, if you will, a royal court still in its proverbial training wheels. I think that Katherine married Thomas in secret, and arguably with indecent swiftness, not because she was somehow simply too giddy in the presence of his furry face to control herself, because after all this was a thrice-widowed 30-something who had shown that she clearly had the common sense and self-control to manage to outlive Henry VIII. And so, if personal desire was all that was driving her to marry Thomas, then I think she could have done so in public and after an appropriate period of mourning for the king. So for me, the speed and the secrecy are clear signs that something else was afoot. I also think this might have been why the marriage elicited such displeasure from Edward Seymour and his wife, because they recognised it as the play for power that I think it was. I do find myself wondering how things might have played out if Katherine Parr had not died from complications of childbirth in 1548. But perhaps that is something to explore in a counterfactual history video for the future. Last up, we're jumping forward again, this time to the very beginning of the next century. On the 8th of February 1601, Robert Devereux, the disaffected Earl of Essex, led a ragtag band of armed rebels on a march into the City of London, allegedly with the intention of removing Elizabeth's wicked councillors, who were headed then by Robert Cecil. Essex hoped that he might enjoy the authority that he apparently believed to be his by right. This uprising was put down within hours. Essex and some of his co-conspirators were soon found treasonous and then executed before the month was over. The day before their uprising, Essex and his cronies had spent time at the Globe Theatre, enjoying a production of Shakespeare's Richard II. However, they had paid this company, then the Lord Chamberlain's men, to disobey the censoring demands regarding this play. They paid for them to stage the prohibited deposition scene, which showed Richard II's crown being taken by the future Henry IV. After hearing that this had occurred, Queen Elizabeth I reportedly exclaimed, quote, "I am Richard II, know ye not that?" My abiding question about this event is, how on earth did Shakespeare's company get away, seemingly, with less even than a slap on the wrist? Instead, they were permitted to maintain such a prominent position for the rest of Elizabeth's reign that they found themselves perfectly placed to obtain the royal patent in the next reign, to become the king's men around 2 months after James acceded to the throne. And so, I've come to wonder if this was in fact a reward for a job well done by the company or by some or indeed one of its members. The Earl of Essex was popular in England, but also potentially with King James VI of Scots, who would go on to become King James I of England. Essex and James had been in contact for some time through discreet letters. Essex was young, dashingly handsome, and happy to champion James's claim to the English throne. And these factors likely made him almost irresistibly appealing to James. It was likely that if, or rather when, James claimed the English throne, that Essex's power would be virtually unrivalled. I think this was very bad news for Robert Cecil. who had become Elizabeth's chief minister after the death of his father, Lord Burleigh, in 1598. And so, by 1601, Robert was still new to the upper rungs of governmental power at a time when a new regime was clearly fairly close on the horizon. He was involved in a factional battle with the Earl of Essex, a man that the likely successor to Elizabeth looked sure to favour. He almost certainly knew that if he made his own overtures to James, then it would get back to Essex, which would in turn risk his position, if not his life, before James took the throne. The removal of Essex removed this risk. It also made space for the attempt of a charm offensive that might, just might, garner and hold James's attention for a sufficient period for Robert Cecil to establish his authority into the next regime too. So I wonder, having potentially had fairly in-depth access to the behind-the-scenes information about all the work that was done to entrap and bring down James's mother, Mary Queen of Scots, did Cecil have what it took to concoct a plan? Did he already have an informant, or indeed informants, in the Lord Chamberlain's men, or was he simply contacted by them once they had already been approached and bribed by members of the Essex faction? I think one of these things was the case, and that Robert Cecil saw the value of being pre-warned about this planned uprising, but of choosing to allow it to play out, with the uncut performance of Richard II included. Because by doing so, safe in the knowledge, or perhaps just willing to gamble, that he could snuff out any rising, I think Cecil was banking on the fact that Elizabeth would be forced to see Essex not simply as insubordinate and reckless, but as traitorous. While the first two might be accepted as charmingly exasperating, something a quick banishment or the removal of a monopoly might deal with, the third was absolutely non-negotiable when it came to the response required. Traitors were to be executed. So I think the Lord Chamberlain's men, some, maybe all of them, solved a problem that Robert Cecil saw himself facing in the next reign. And when that reign began, Robert Cecil set things in motion for those men to be rewarded, to become the King's men. But what do you think of the three ideas I have put forward today? Do you think I'm onto something with any or all of them, or do you think I am just speculating much too far? As always, I'm looking forward to reading your conversations in the comment section underneath this video. I'd also love it if you could pop an emoji or a social glyph in the comments too, because that will help to boost the engagement, and allegedly, the more engagement a video gets, the more YouTube say they share it out, and that should help us to grow our community. In terms of which emoji, I'm wondering, if you're buying what I'm selling in this video, maybe you put the emoji related to each of the topics, maybe one, maybe all of them, in the comments. So, how about for the sickness idea with the princes, you do an emoji related to sickness. For Katherine's royal power, something about queenship maybe. And for the last one, maybe something theatrical. If you think I'm on the money with any of the topics we've looked at today, put an emoji connected to them. You can also find me elsewhere on social media. I will leave links to the place you can find me on the internet in my description box. Please do follow me over on some or all of those so we can continue this conversation and start some others. I do hope you enjoyed this video and found it useful. If you did, please share it with your friends. If you like the channel, let your pals know about it. You can tell me about this video in particular by hitting the thumbs up. Please do subscribe to the channel, and if you think you are subscribed, now is the ideal time to check to make sure you've not been mysteriously unsubscribed against your will. While you are there, checking, subscribing, maybe resubscribing, please do hit the bell icon that sits beside the subscribe button and then select all in the drop down that will appear, and that way YouTube claim they will tell you when I've next uploaded and also when I'm next going live, which I will be doing to talk about the history news headlines that have happened in the preceding weeks or indeed month. We have got our failsafe. Head to my website, it will be linked. It is www.katrinamarchant.com. Head to the contact page and in the box, please put your email address, then hit sign up. That will add you to my list and will let me send you out an email once a week to let you know what I've been up to, but also to send you useful links for my content for the coming days. I hope you're going to have a great day whatever you're doing, and I look forward to speaking to you all in my next video. Take care of yourselves. Bye-bye for now.